Hi, I'm Craig Duma of PentecostalPastor.com, and with me tonight is Dr. Brian Peterson. Dr. Peterson is the professor of Old Testament at Lee University in the School of Religion here in Cleveland, Tennessee. He is also, you also teach Hebrew,
Yes.
and you have a kind of a specialty as well in ancient Near East culture and customs. Is that
Yeah.
right? So you do that. He's also, if you've been watching some of our previous videos, he's also not quite I shouldn't even say amateur. You're beyond the amateur archaeologist at this particular point, but he travels over the Middle East, in Israel, does a lot of archaeological work in many summers. But he is also an author, and we have had him on our program or in for a video on several occasions. The last was John's use of the book of Ezekiel. But tonight, Dr. Peterson is going to be talking. We're going to be working through this book in a conversational manner. It's Genesis as Torah. And it just recently came out. In fact, I think it was just earlier this year. Is that
Yes.
correct? And it's just an outstanding look at the book of Genesis. I'm personally interested in anything that is done from a good biblical standpoint on the book of Genesis, simply because Genesis is under attack in so many ways. You're approaching this from a little bit different perspective, but still with the as far as Genesis as Torah, but still you're dealing with it as a real historical approach.
Yes.
So, Brian, I took your book here, but will you kind of give us an introduction to your book?
Sure. This particular book came out of some of my work when I was doing one of my previous books, reading Genesis 19 as Torah, when we were dealing with the sin of Sodom and what was the sin of Sodom, that particular book.
Yeah.
And I don't believe we've actually interviewed on that one yet.
Actually, no, we did. We did do an interview, just a one-time interview
Okay.
on that one. But one of these days we'll have to work that through
Okay.
too. Yeah.
So in that particular book, I had done some look at
Am
how...
I that forgettable?
No, I've just done a lot of these.
Oh, I'm just kidding. Yeah.
So what happened is, from that particular bunch of research that I did, I realized, the method that I was using for that particular chapter actually kind of could flesh out and be used for the entire book, any narrative in the book of Genesis. Also, my work in the Pentateuch and my teaching in the Pentateuch, questions that come up from students, like how do we apply this law, how do we use the law? One of the other things I have noted, especially when I was reading and interacting with scholarship, is that they have a tendency to, when they speak of law, especially Old Testament law, they have a tendency to go to those areas of Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy in particular, that are dealing with the covenant code in Exodus 20:23, the holiness code, the Deuteronomic code, and so forth. And they say, well, there's the law. And that's true. But what I was arguing and what I felt is, then what do we do with Genesis? Because it's narrative. And after all, this is an introduction to Torah. And as an introduction, shouldn't we read it as law? And is there something about Genesis that gives it primacy of place to put it up front of the Torah?
Right.
And so my basic method in this particular book is to read through the narratives of Genesis, and this again is a kind of a precursor. I'm doing a commentary on Genesis starting next year. But what I was looking at as I was working through this material is I was noticing that the narratives have a tendency to be almost like case studies for later law. So where you have this little specific law, you shall love the Lord your God and only him shall you serve, there's no other God beside him. Well, what does that look like in a narrative? Genesis chapter 1. And so I begin to look at the narratives and unpack how, for example, the Ten Commandments are shown in the narratives, how specific laws or legislation appear in the narratives, and so forth. And so from that, as you can see, I fleshed this out into a complete book and looked at 50 different chapters.
And I like your approach. There, I want to ask you. You have what I think is really kind of a unique. I don't want to say definition. You haven't redefined it, but you have a really great explanation, or I guess you'd say definition of what law is, which is what it's. You see, it's not only God's commands, but it's also the instructional aspect, right? So law is used as not only to command you how to live, but it's also to really as an instructional guide as well, right?
Absolutely.
And then the other thing that I think that you point out in there, if I'm in this section, I know you pointed out, I'm trying to remember if it was in this particular section, about how the law doesn't just come out of nowhere, right? That there is that there's always been a law, right?
Yes.
I mean, law is inescapable.
Yes.
And so, even though it wasn't stated as perhaps Moses put it down, you point out through here, hey, listen, these are laws, like you said, but they didn't just spring from out of nowhere. Israel already had an idea of law. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. In my conclusion, I actually note one particular scholar who points out the fact that all of the laws of the ancient Near East, be that from the ancient Hittites, the ancient Mesopotamians, ancient Egyptians, had to stem from someplace, and there was this moral guide behind it, and that's a moral guide with a capital M. That God is giving instruction, and some of these are just plainly revealed in nature. Romans chapter 1, Paul talks about this. And so for someone like Abraham or someone like a Noah or whatever, they're keeping the law. As a matter of fact, Abraham is said, and he kept the laws of God perfectly.
Right, yeah.
And the commandments. It's the same language that's used later to speak of the Torah. And I believe that this is the commands, or these are the issues that, or the things that God has revealed within nature.
Well, we know right away that, I mean, for instance, Cain knows there doesn't have to be a stated "thou shalt not murder" before Cain understands that he's guilty of murder, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, so you go all the way through here, and you're exactly right. I mean, every even I think you even mentioned some of the sacrificial areas up until it becomes simply a Levitical role, but there's even kind of the laws of sacrifice that are there. Is that right?
I mean, sacrifice, comes in as early as chapter 3.
Yeah.
And you have God himself performing the first sacrifice. And so we see it throughout the patriarchal narratives consistently, where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they're building altars and offering sacrifices. Well, where are they getting that from? It was obviously something that was established early on, even with Cain and Abel. I mean, that was the number one issue that created the problem for them, and ultimately Cain kills Abel. So I think that when you're looking at these types of narratives, you have to ask of the narrative, ask of the author, why did you record this? And that's what I always tell my students, always ask why. Why is this here? And when I started looking at this material, I realized that this makes perfect sense as case law.
Right, and it's interesting. Now, you had mentioned that in teaching some of this over in your class, you had some questions. Some students said, "Well, what are you talking about? This is law for. This is narrative." I guess I have a question. I've never been able to figure this out. Well, I guess I do, because I'll maybe share that at some other point. My idea isn't really that relevant, but you have people today. I mean, it's interesting that as soon as you start talking about Genesis and law, I mean, it's like people recoil. It's like I don't know what it is about law that, especially from God, that people they don't like. They just don't like they don't like the premise. They don't like they don't like the idea that there really could be. In fact, their whole sometimes I think that they think the Old Testament God is some repressive, he puts a burdensome law on them, and that's only possible to think in terms of Jesus Christ and the new law, the law of Christ, compared to that, because in the Old Testament, let's say that that there is no different law, let's just say, for instance, that we're under the Old Testament law today. Right. I always want to ask people, okay, so what was there, 615 maybe, when you stretch it out from the 10 Commandments and you talk about all the other things, but or 612 or whatever there is, but let's just say that that's the case. Boy, that, in the Old Testament, God says this is a great law. He said this law is going to be such that all of your enemies, all the foreign nations, are going to look at you and say, what God has such a beautiful law of this, and it would actually be for the converting of the nations. And David cries out and he says, boy, I love your law. I mean, it makes me wiser than my enemies. Part of that instruction part that you talk about. Why is it that today, and I'm not saying that Old Testament law carries over, I personally think it does. I think it right in totality. Right. But but why is it that people just don't like law?
Well, I think you hit at the heart of it when you said that people automatically assume that the God of the Old Testament is different than the God of the New. This is the age-old problem. They recoil from this fact that they see within the biblical text of the Old Testament what appears to be a vengeful or in some way, in some case, almost capricious nature of God. And I said that couldn't be farther from the truth. When you start reading and putting things in context, you see that we have roughly 1,500 years of history that we're dealing with. Now, that's if you say Moses is the author of this material. And you look at about 1,500 years of history that is being recorded. And you go to the New Testament, and you've got, 33 years roughly of history. 33 to maybe maximum 70 if you go from Christ's life until to the Revelator. And still you see people being smitten dead in the New Testament, Ananias and Sapphira, and curses being called down on Alexandria, the coppersmith, Alexander the coppersmith, and so forth.
Paul prays a drive-by imprecatory prayer. Alexander silversmith has done me much harm. May God repay to him.
Yeah, exactly. and the book of Revelation, chapter 6, how long, O Lord, will you allow the martyrs underneath the altar to go unavenged?
Yeah.
And this is someone in the perfect state, and they still want God's justice. And so what we see in the Old Testament is a longer period of history. And yes, there are times when there's a lot of killing that goes on, but it must be read in the light of God's justice. And so what people do is they recoil when they think of a law. Our immediate response, or our modern response, is to say, I'm under grace.
Yeah.
And so therefore that covers everything. Yes, we have grace, but God is still a God of law.
Right.
In the same way as a parent, I extend a lot of grace to my kids. Yeah. But there still comes a point where the law says you do not walk out onto that road unaccompanied, and there has to be consequences in order for instruction. And that's the same with the Old Testament law. What we are seeing consistently, especially I think in Genesis, is what does the breaking of a law actually look like? What happens? And let's just take one, for example. Chapter 38, 39, which parallels the Joseph narrative with his brother Judah back in the land of Canaan. In chapter 38, you have Judah who refuses to follow through on levirate marriage. Well, what happens to him when he doesn't follow through on levirate marriage? That was the law of the land. That was the law established by God, that if a brother died, you would take the son, or the next youngest brother, would raise up a child from the widow, so that man's seed would never be eliminated from the land of Israel. And what does Judah do? He refuses to give his final son to Tamar. Well, guess what happens? A curse basically comes upon Judah. Loses two of his sons, and ultimately his own daughter-in-law tricks him into having sex with him, and raising up two kids, Peretz being the one that the messianic line comes through. And so there you have a case in point of what happens in this later law about levirate marriage. What happens if you don't do it? This is a case in point. And so it becomes instructional in this manner. So I think that this recoiling from the law is not something that is necessarily a good thing. Like you say, the law is good.
Yeah.
Paul in Romans talks about how the law pointed out the error in that sense, and so people need to know. And who wants to have their errors pointed out? And that's why we have a tendency to recoil from the law. We don't want to see that. When you look at how this is instructed, though, and I think where this kind of plays out in a family dynamic, and why it's so important, and why it's applicable today, and why we need to use the principles of how Torah, for example, was instructed and taught. In the book of Deuteronomy, God has given a command through Moses to the people saying, when you study this law, I want you to talk about it when you rise up, when you lay down, when you're walking on the road, when you're walking in the field. Well, how do you do that? Are you sitting there just reciting commandments? Or are you telling stories? And you're telling your sons and your daughters, hey, do you remember the story back there when Abraham nearly sacrificed his son Isaac? What does this teach us? And so I think that those types of narratives now become instructional, and I think that's where you're seeing those types of commands about instructing.
This kind of reminds me over in Joshua where they built kind of the mounds, and they said when you see those, tell that there's a remembrance of those stories. Tell them, and apparently they didn't do it because the Bible says there arose a generation that knew not God nor His marvelous works, and so those stories weren't being told apparently, or at least if
Absolutely.
they were being dismissed. But
Hosea chapter 4, verse 6, I think, encapsulates the whole issue of later in Israel's history of what happens when you go generation and generation not teaching Torah and not instructing. He says, my people perish for lack of knowledge.
yeah,
And then he goes on in the second half of the verse and says, it's because the priests have not done their job. And that was instructing the people. Because the priests instruct the people then instruct their children in the next generation. And that's us today. I mean, when you stop and consider, who's sitting in the pulpit or sitting in the pew, you've got multi-generational churches. Are we doing our due diligence in passing on from one generation to the next our experience?
Yeah, and boy, that's had some tragic results in not doing that. I mean, now it's come to the point where, I think like what you said. I mean, now today, I mean, we have I shouldn't even say the millennials. I mean, unfortunately, we have too many non-millennials that go back, and I mean, they don't even believe in a historic Adam. They don't believe in. I mean, they would. I mean, the argument would be that, hey, listen, these are all stories meant to show kind of like the overall development. I mean, I don't think it's got to the point where Abraham doesn't exist. But I mean, I've listened to people say that Moses was really a composite, that he wasn't a real person giving real laws. It was just kind of a accumulation around there, and nothing special from God. I mean, it's amazing how they just think that people just evolve these things. And of course, in this, you're actually pointing out the opposite. No, they didn't. Here it is, and this is right from God, who's who. I would think that there is the being made in the image of God Himself. That there is that imprint. I mean, I would think that even here as life goes on from Adam forward, even after the fall, that image of God, however you want to place it, is so powerful that you just know what God, the righteousness of God, even if you're trying to suppress it in unrighteousness, that is still pushing through, and that law is inevitable.
Right. I mean, it's funny that you should mention that, because I'm just talking about the Imago Dei today with my wife, the image of God and what that means. God has placed upon each and every one of us not only a desire to know Him. It's kind of that hole in the heart, so to speak, that we need God. But more importantly, that we are eternal beings, that we are made to live forever. I mean, that was the Garden of Eden, right? The tree of the life was meant for us to eat and live forever. And ultimately live out God's laws on a daily basis. It's only sin in the fall that mars that and gives us or basically makes us unable, short of the Spirit and short of the work of Christ, to actually live out the law.
Brian, I know that this is kind of just a real basic question, and we've talked about this before, but just I guess just for the record, none of this would flow. I mean, would be true if it wasn't for the fact that God's word in Genesis 1. Well, I have this special passion for anything in Genesis 1 through. If that's not true, then really the premise is of no interest, right? Or even no effect. It has to be. I mean, that has to be true, and God has to have. It was in a story form. That's the way God did it. He tells the story to us, but it's true.
Yeah. And I think that what you're touching on is something that is happening within a lot of evangelical circles today, where people are struggling with how do we marry science and the Bible. And what originally started out, Genesis chapter 1, maybe Genesis chapter 2, that's just a good myth, has now branched into Genesis chapter 3, Genesis chapter 4. Well, now you get rid of the historical Adam. And then ultimately that has bled to, there was no flood, and there was no Noah, and of course no Tower of Babel. But most evangelicals at that point will stop and say, but chapter 12, that's where everything changes and becomes historical with Abraham. But this goes back even into much early time period of the 20th century and late 19th century, where some people were even arguing that there wasn't an Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and so forth. And this is now, that I think is going to be the next kind of hurdle that evangelicals are going to jump over and say, yeah, well, Genesis is all just a good story. I struggle with that because at that point you have undermined a lot of what we have.
Yeah. Well, I
later.
would think that I would think that it would be key because, frankly, if there is no true fall, I mean, if there is no fall, and if we just, I mean, actually, if we just came from worse to better, if we're moving up the evolutionary scale, there would actually be no reason for law, and it would always, or if there was, it would always be changing.
Yeah.
I mean, there has to have been this depravity that came in, where all of a sudden, I mean, and you see how fast it is. I mean, my goodness, I mean, I don't know how long it was, but not very far after Adam and Eve leave the Garden of Eden, you've got a brother killing a brother, then lying to God about it, and trying to be deceptive there. And then as soon as God tells him not to do something, don't go out, you're going to be a wanderer, goes out, tries to build a city. I mean, all this stuff is, and then later on, God just looks down, he says, wow, look at the wickedness of man, look at where it's went. If it wasn't for, I think that being made in the image of God like you're talking about, I mean, that would have, and with the free will, we would have been freely following the righteousness that God had made into us rather than rebelling against it. I think that the entire law is what you were talking about. That's why I loved it. Correction, telling us how to live, but also instruction into our life. How do we follow God? How are we more like Him? And I'm not saying that every area, but I mean, it comes over today. Obviously, it doesn't. But I mean. But all of those areas, led to lessons in holiness. We'd forgot that. How are we? Without holiness, no man sees the Lord. So, however that may have been transformed into today, that stuff was vitally important. And Paul says that we need to go back and read that stuff because it teaches us now, right?
Absolutely.
Sorry, I didn't mean to go on my little monologue
No.
because, I'm just, I'm excited about this because I think that we have, I think in our churches and in our culture, I think we have seen we just don't want to touch it anymore. We think it's just bad, and I've just never understood that. When everywhere the Bible talks about God's law, it talks about it as being it's great. The only thing that I see changed from the old to the new is it says, hey, the old law was great and it was glorious, really glorious, but it fades in glory compared to the new law in Jesus Christ. There's never a denigration of the law at any point.
Yeah. And I think that probably where some people struggle with, there are portions of the Torah that I believe, and Christ talks about this when he's dealing with the issues of divorce and remarriage,
right?
Or at least divorce with the Pharisees.
Well, now you're meddling. Come on. No,
yeah.
Okay.
Where he is saying, because of the hardness of your hearts,
right.
Moses allowed certain things, and I think that what you're seeing, for example, in Deuteronomy 24 is those laws on divorce. Some people will look at that and say, well, that's a horrible law. But Christ himself is saying the reason it's there is because of our fallen nature. Because God recognizes, hey, this is what we want.
Right.
And so he is basically taking them and acquiescing, bringing them from that point, because he knows that Christ is the end, and he's going to bring us along. So there are portions of the law that are troubling. I always tell my students, if I could take any part of the Bible and get rid of it, I would get rid of Leviticus 25. What do you do with all those laws about owning other people, slavery and whatnot? But also, I always tell my students, I follow that up by saying, but even within the law, God has placed the undermining of those kind of, where he acquiesced to man and women's fallenness. He undermined those more negative aspects of the law, where he says, okay, so if you own a slave, quote unquote, or a servant, and you mistreat him and he runs away, you can't go get him.
Right.
Well, that's
if they were a fellow covenant member, right? It's not if it was one of the conquered ones, but it was.
No, this is any person that you have underneath of your, because if not, what you have is indentured servants, which are the fellow Israelites. But if this is a conquered enemy and you have mistreated them and they run to somebody else, you cannot give them up. See, we think often, and I don't want to go on a tangent, but when you're dealing with slavery, we often think of 19th century America, South.
Right.
That is not the picture of what's in the biblical text when it comes
No.
even to issues of slavery. While there was this passing on of slaves or ownership from one generation to the other, most of that was done in such a context that it was a much more loving relationship
Yeah.
than what we saw in the South.
Right.
And that's why God undermines the whole concept
Right.
by, hey, you mistreat this person in any way and they run away, you cannot go get them.
Right.
And
Right.
they're free.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's true. And in fact, actually, like the American slave, or slavery all the way up through that time, it violates God's law too. You cannot kidnap
Yeah.
a person. I mean,
Right.
that's a death penalty. You
Death
can't kidnap
penalty.
them.
Exactly.
And our entire slave population was kidnapped. I
Yeah.
mean, my goodness.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so yeah. So well, we'll come back and talk about more of that. I'd love to talk about that too. And I'm sure that you're doing. You teach Old Testament survey,
Yes.
so you cover this on a regular basis.
Yes.
So we'll be able to get you back, and you'll be loaded for bear, so to speak,
Yeah.
on that, right?
Yes.
So, but I think that that would be worth talking about and working through some of those
Yeah.
difficult things. Nobody
Yeah.
wants to work through the difficult areas,
Yeah.
and they're very important,
Yeah.
right? I mean, how do you really take care of the easy ones if you
Yeah.
can't kind of work through some of the more difficult ones?
Absolutely.
So, is there any in terms of the introduction and moving into this? Is there anything that I know that I've spoke too much on this. Is there any area that you would like to add to this before we move on?
Sure. I think that there was something you said early on about if, for example, if it's not from God, if it's not Mosaic, if it's not just a compilation by a group of people over a period of time, then it loses some of its force. And I agree with that. I think that one of the points that I try to make as I was reading or wrote in the introduction, that whoever's writing this, and I believe it's Mosaic, I mean, it's kind of that, does it walk like a duck, quack like a duck? It probably is a duck. Whoever's writing this knows the context of what the Israelites are dealing with, I think, coming out of Egypt. He is writing it. He has authority, someone who's going to, obviously the Israelites are going to listen to. It kind of sounds to me when I was writing this and was researching it, my goodness, it sounds like this is Mosaic in the sense that once the authorship is given to that particular character, then along with the fact that he is getting it directly from God, that is where law gets its authority. If not, it's just, well, that's your opinion. And that's unfortunately where we are today.
Yeah.
And literally some people look at the biblical text and they say, well, that's one opinion. Well, no.
Kind of the Nietzsche thing.
Yeah.
God is dead.
Yeah.
I mean, he but he didn't really mean that. I mean, but if God indeed was dead, then God really wasn't dead. Every person was their own God, determining right and wrong in their own eyes, which is what he was saying, that there was no law, and the law of the strongest. But I'm sorry, it's a, so it's, boy, we have a lot of reclaiming to do.
Yeah.
I'm an optimist. I think God is raising up. I don't think that. I think God. First of all, I think that God's church is a great organization or body or whatever you want to say, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. So I think while we have some ups and downs, and sometimes we look at it only through American eyes, I think God is raising up people, and I think to whatever extent you would take credit for, I think God is raising up people that will take a look at these and bring that back. I think the church is going to kind of, I guess, reclaim some of her former glory and go from glory to glory.
Yeah, and I think that, ultimately, I always, tell some of my students when they facing hard times, I say, God has the final say. At the end of the day, Satan can throw whatever he wants against you, but God will have the final say. And that's what I feel with his law. I mean, when I unpacked this material and trying to point out what it's teaching and what's instructing, especially in Genesis 1 and 2, there's some powerful things there that are applicable to what we're dealing with today in our Western culture when it comes to sexuality. Why is it that God spends so much time in this opening 2 chapters talking about the foundation of culture? And no matter what, I can tell you what the Bible says about it, but our culture, has a tendency to want to recoil from that because that doesn't match their narrative. But God will have the final say.
Great. Well, Brian, thank you.
No problem.
We'll be back with another session on this, just like we always are on these tours. Thank you.